As someone who has been politically active for 6 years, I've tried to structure this video from a vague political point of view, but I am bound to have some bias, especially since this is based on my political experience and opinions. Here are the top 7 tips for political newbies.
Tip number 1. Find a framework.
I believe that finding and developing a framework is one of the most important things a person can do. By this, I mean some sort of method, approach, or philosophical lens you can use to interpret the world. Most fall on one of two sides, idealism or materialism. If your goal is to be as close to correct as possible, idealism probably will not achieve that goal, as with idealism it is very easy to reject critical thinking and to fall into the slope of dogma. Materialists are also capable of falling into that slope. Even when you base on reality, you're still interpreting it through your subjective human perspective. And likewise, science is merely a human understanding of reality. But because of this pursuit of understanding reality, some materialists can easily find material interpretations as the absolute truth, which can equally lead to rejecting critical thinking and falling into the slope of dogma. The goal is to balance critical thinking and interpreting reality. Obviously, being critical of everything doesn't mean you don't believe in anything. The sky is definitely blue, and we can trust that many facts about the world are true and have been thoroughly proven.
Tip number 2. Ideologies can be overwhelming.
Most likely, you are in a position of neutrality, even if you are watching this with a decent grasp of the political world. Remaining vigilant and critical puts you in a fair position, where you are more like an observer of all things out there. Essentially like being anti-sectarian with the intent to learn. What matters is what makes sense to you, in combination with checking the facts to support what you hear and what you know. An important quote I find a virtue is, "No research, no right to speak." And with that, I add, you should be able to explain what you support in your own words. Frankly, this is where there comes the harsh reality of politics. Some people are more into it than others, and some people are more advantaged and abled than others. I myself am definitely neurodivergent, so it's very often difficult to digest things I've read, especially content-heavy and theory-heavy texts. It's good to look for alternatives like audiobooks or video essays, but usually when it comes to understanding political theory, doing the reading is almost mandatory, no matter how difficult it is.
Tip number 3. Avoid supermarket ideologies.
Point of view. You're already 16 years old, and you've realized that Karl Marx pushed communism forward with their famous manifesto, so you want to create your own ideology with your own book. Or, you noticed all the anarcho-ideologies with different colored flags and symbols, so you decided to create your own anarcho-something else. Seeing the problem in this shouldn't be too difficult. It's so easy to become idealistically ambitious or opportunistic if you're just trying to create the new synthesis or have your name in history. Besides creating your own ideology, other supermarket ideologies happen when oversimplified politics become the framework of an individual, such as picking out the things you like of certain ideologies and combining them together without determining if doing so makes sense or not. Oversimplified political understanding stems from things such as online tests or the left-right dichotomy. Whether it is 8 values or the political compass, tests can be useful, but they should not be put on a pedestal. They can point you in a direction like a compass, but they are not your GPS. As for the left-right dichotomy, it is extremely oversimplified as well as redundant. For starters, every ideology has a bias and some define terms differently than others. A conservative might see social democracy as extreme, but to a communist, they might not even be considered a leftist. How do we know who is right without making favoritism towards an ideology on a linear graph or compass meant to be fair and objective to all ideologies? Secondly, how do you measure each ideology anyway? Is it a point system? How are each ideology given points? Leftism and rightism give a general umbrella of ideologies, but there's also the question if leftism consists merely of anti-capitalist ideologies. But if that is the case, then is third positionism not a brand of fascism? Or is it left-wing? Would feudalism be left-wing? Or could you argue that leftism is anything progressive from conservation? But where do neocons go? Is reactionary more conservative and right-wing, or technically progressing from the status quo? And if it is just the status quo, then is that for all, or for each individual country? Is China right-wing then, or isn't it communist? It's enough to get the head spinning in a terribly flawed way to see ideologies that hardly hold any level of relevance.
Tip number 4. Pick your battles.
Debates are an interesting activity. Whether it is online or in real life, real debates definitely require a lot more knowledge in the brain and a sense of fast thinking, while online, you have the advantage of searching for your sources and taking some reasonable time to think. One important thing that I've personally learned for myself when it comes to debates is the purpose of debating. If your goal is merely to win because it pleases your ego and gives you some social points and dopamine, you can't exactly have a productive debate or debate in good faith. A debate should be about sharing ideas, making corrections, and being educated, but never about winning for the sake of winning or for changing people's minds. Some people are more open-minded and critical than others, but most people can't be changed in a day, especially when you factor in things like Poe's law, who your opponent is as a person, and how dogmatic or critical they might be. I generally don't plan out debates, but usually, I can already get an idea if I would debate someone or not, depending on how they speak about their views, beliefs, and opinions. If they're condescending, insulting, fallacious, assertive, dogmatic, etc., I will tend to consider that bad faith and try not to debate them in the future. A debate also requires you to be willing to consider the position of the opposition. This is why I wouldn't debate fascists, because I'm not willing to consider the possibility that the Holocaust didn't happen, that totalitarianism could be justified, to consider any superiority of a certain skin pigmentations or ethnicities, and I don't debate obvious human rights.
Tip number 5. Understand definitions.
When it comes to any form of political discussion, when engaging with other ideologies, it is important to note that different ideologies have different definitions, and this is acceptable in political discourse. For instance, the word socialism alone is such a large umbrella term that means different things to different people. To some, it's when the government does stuff, or it's a national rebirth, belief in Jewish finance capitalism and privatization, or it's a state transition towards communism, or it's when workers own the means of production, or it's literally just an interchangeable synonym for communism. It's important to establish an individual's definition of concepts and words. If we're gatekeeping a term like socialism, then we enter a pointless debate of, that's not real socialism. Instead, we could have addressed our definitions and had a productive conversation. When it comes to productive debates, focusing on beliefs and theory is preferable to labels. This is not to disregard strawman arguments about your own beliefs, however, which can be important to defend. If someone is trying to say what you believe socialism is when you think otherwise, then it's going to be hard to have a productive conversation about your beliefs and you should move on.
Tip number 6. Admit ignorance.
When you do not know something, it is important, courageous, and honest to admit that you do not, than to pretend that you do know something. Knowledge does not make intelligence anyway. It can be easy to be intimidated by people who seem to know what they are talking about. Instead of agreeing with them wholeheartedly, you can still demonstrate your intellectual strengths by asking for things like sources, elaboration, or informative recommendations like books and videos. If you want to challenge them but you know you're not familiar with what they know, admitting ignorance and asking questions instead might be more productive to you. Or alternatively, you can say that you've heard something that challenges their view, allowing them to give their take or counter that view without directly debating you, and allowing you to still be educated in the process. Similar to ignorance, if your goal is to be as close to correctness as possible, conspiratorial thinking is counterproductive. Essentially, this is making patterns or connections without a good reason to believe. Educated guesses at least have some level of plausibility that still shouldn't be fully believed in until they at least become a theory, as in the actual scientific definition of a theory. It's also easy to have a cognitive bias. If you've decided to visit a country and do some journalism, but you already wanted to prove that the country was terrible, then your search for proof will probably be biased with the lens of proving yourself right. It's better to be neutral in these sorts of things and to see what can be discovered, and then thinking and acting accordingly.
Tip number 7. Find good sources.
In the world of searching for sources, it can be overwhelming and take effort to even learn how to determine a good source from a bad one. Oftentimes, the average person will watch something on the news, like hearing that North Korea claims to have discovered a unicorn, believe it, and go about their lives. And while a person's opinion on whether North Korea actually made that claim or not can seem harmless, when you start believing that a country has claimed something that seems so silly, it's easy to start believing things said about the country. The way my policy works is if it's too much effort to look into something, simply don't believe it and remain skeptical. Good sources should usually display their proper research into the subject, should be done by credible people, or by credible websites and institutions. It really can be frustrating, but it's also worth it if your desire is to be as accurate as possible. Basic interpretations of political quotes or passages taken from books should simply be traced to the authors or books themselves, to understand the context of the subject being written about. Quotes are often misquoted, quoted out of context, or completely farce. Even credible institutions can get it wrong, as many don't expect most people to actually dig into their sources, and they're right. Another good method is the CRAAP test, that is, currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. Here are some questions to ask when evaluating sources. When was the source published? Is the source updated? Is thorough information presented? Is the information relevant to the topic? Is the content of the source superficial or detailed? Is the readership level appropriate? Should the readership level be simplistic or sophisticated? What are the backgrounds of the authors or editors? Is the source approved by other credible people or institutions? Are sources published by media, institutions, or self-published? Can claims be verified in other sources? Is there a list of works cited to indicate the depth of the author's knowledge? Is the purpose of the source stated? And lastly, is the subject approached from an objective or biased standpoint? Though when it comes to bias, know that all things will be biased. A source that suggests that the Holodomor was a famine and not a genocide is of course biased on the idea that it was a famine and not a genocide. This sounds like circular reasoning, but the point is that it is necessary to differentiate and tell when biases are appropriate, and how those biases can influence the sources presented. This has been 7 tips for political newbies. If you liked this video or learned something new, give it a like. If you didn't, then leave a dislike. Subscribe for more content like this.